good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Dr. Amlan Roy. He's a leading expert on macroeconomics and demographics and the author of Demographics Unravelled, which we're here today at Shangri-La Hotel KL. He's one of the speakers at the International Social Wellbeing Conference 2025, which has the theme of Living to 100. Are we ready? So Dr. Roy, that's a really interesting theme to be covering at the conference today. And I know you have said before that demographics is really more than just looking at the birth rate and looking at the breakdown of different ages, aging, the aging categories. So when we think about demographics, what is it and why is it that we need to pay attention to it?
Thank you very much, Melissa, and great to have me on the show. I'm very delighted and honored. Demographics is a fascinating subject that I've studied over the last 25 years. Peter Drucker, the biggest management guru of 20th century, basically said demographics is the single most important factor that we do not pay attention to. But when we do pay attention, we miss the point. I argue most of the world, including me, in the past missed the point because we associate demographics with age.
That's right.
Age is not the single summary statistic of an individual. Be it Melissa, be it Joanne, be it myself, Amlan, we are much more than our age. Two individuals the same age, my wife and me, we have very, very different consumption characteristics. Demographics comes from two roots, demos, people, characteristics. To me, the two most important characteristics of everyone is from the time we are born till the date we die, we are a consumer. And we are consuming different things. Two individuals of 50 years, 60 years, 40 or 30, or even 6 years nowadays, two children don't buy exactly the same toys. So we consume differently, we work differently. To understand that, we need to understand gender, age also. We need to understand family background. Are you the single child? Are you 3 children? Do you live in rural Malaysia? Do you live in urban Malaysia? What's your income? What's your wealth? All these things change your makeup. Which neighborhood do you live in? And therefore, anything which affects consumer psychology and worker psychology has to do with demographics. It's much more than one characteristic.
Okay, so if we're not paying attention to demographics the way we ought to, and we're not really understanding the different compositions of different demographies, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions then when governments or public policymakers, what misconceptions do they have or they tend to make about demographic change?
Excellent question, and it is the core. I love it, this question, because it is at the core. The three misconceptions of demographics are, first, demographics is only age, which have already changed. Second, demographics, people say, is long-term. Why is it long-term? Because 20 years later, they think Melissa will be exactly the same as somebody who's 20 years older. Amlan will be exactly the same as somebody 15 years older, if I live 15 years more. However, demographics has immediate, short-term, medium-term and long-term effects. Why? Because consumers are consuming today, workers are working today. That affects inflation today, GDP today, asset prices today, and lots of other things. So taking demographics just as a constant of age, moving age along, does not keep things constant because consumers respond to new products, the environment, to policy and other things.
Variables change.
Yeah,
yes.
And we really need to look at it in a much more intuitive, interpretive and holistic fashion rather than saying age determines everything.
Is there anything else other than looking at, not just looking at age and not just thinking of it as just long term? Is there any other misconceptions about demographics that we need to address?
Yes, good. I was forgetting this. If you look at demographics as consumers and workers, then the income statement and profit of a household, of a company or a nation all depend on demographics. Let's look at Shangri-La. Today, EPF is renting Shangri-La, so they are giving revenues to Shangri-La. The people, the workers in Shangri-La, they are the costs. So consumers equal revenues, workers equal costs. If you look at it that way, income statement and balance sheet of every company in the world and every country is affected by demographics.
Right. Can you give me an example of how demographic change has or the lack of paying attention to demographic change has resulted in to the detriment of a country or a government or population?
Oh, brilliant question again. The core of any country's growth is considered GDP and GDP growth. GDP growth comes from three fundamental demographic components. One is the number of workers. Let's take Malaysia.
Okay.
The number of workers, growth rate of workers in 2025 relative to 2024 is component number one. Component number two is labor productivity growth of the workers. Have they produced more widgets, more factories, more papers, etc.? That becomes component number two. And component number three is hours worked. Are we working more hours? If you add component one, component two, component three, you get GDP growth rate. But if you ignore how productive people are, how many hours they are working, how they are working in terms of quality of hours, you might be very fast on the computer. I might be very slow on the computer. You may be very fast in writing an article. I may be very slow. But what matters is the change in growth rate. You're very high, but I've improved. I want to be like Melisa. So if people don't consider how others are improving, they will get growth rates wrong. Demographics is core to each of these components of growth rate and the demand and supply components of inflation.
Amlan, there seems to be so many different variables when looking at how demographics change and what makes up the composition of any demographic. How do you pay attention to, how do you know what to consider as a variable, what to look at? There's so many moving parts in trying to determine this.
So there are lots of things which affect our psychology and which affect our behavior.
As a consumer.
Yeah, as a consumer. We can't measure all of them. But what we can measure is, are consumers buying more cars? Are they buying more cereals? Are they buying more IT products, toys, etc.? In the aggregate, all those things add up to GDP. Now, at the micro level, the consumer companies, whether it's Procter & Gamble, it's Unilever, it's Danone, and all of them, Pepsi, Coke, they are looking at the consumption changes for Gen X, Gen Y, older people, etc.
Okay.
So they tend to focus a lot more on the demographics at the micro level. I'm looking a lot more at the macro level.
Okay.
So the consumer companies, when they are doing these ad profiles, what are they trying to do? They are trying to get a hook into Melisa's mind and Amlan's mind to change our consumer behavior.
Right.
The companies which are creating, consider WeWork or other places which are helping in terms of people not working in one office, they are trying to change our work culture. So what's happened earlier when we used to have a desktop, it was fixed.
Yes.
Today you don't need a fix.
Look at
and
this.
what have people managed to do? iPads, iPhones, etc. So initially, people only had one type of iPad or iPhone. Now people have different kinds because there are different attributes that attract different people. Somebody needs a docking station on the iPad. Somebody wants to type on the iPad. So products innovate in response to our needs change in response to the products. So it's an interaction of endogenous consumer change and consumer behavior changing and worker behavior. And we can't map everything, but we can say, I don't know what's going on in Melisa's mind or in Joanne's mind, but I can see when they're buying a car or they're buying a meal or they go for a fashion show or they go for makeup or theater, etc., that, oh yeah, these are things which are getting influenced. And then try to understand, oh, Melisa did this, but Melisa's friend didn't do this. What was different? So consumer psychologists and marketing consultants, they look a lot more at it. But at a macro level, I look less at it, but I know that they're at the ground level, the microfoundation.
Amazing. So when you are looking at it, so let's take to this conference's theme for an example. So living to 100. When we think about longer life, longevity and living well, that would affect almost every aspect, healthcare, welfare, how we work, all these systems that are already built for a different type of time. Is it a relic of when people lived shorter lives? And when you think about longevity from a demographics point of view, how is it that you are rethinking systems and institutions?
Oh, the biggest thing is that people are changing all the time. Earlier, we didn't have data on it. If you went into Nordstrom's, which is one of the biggest department stores in Chicago and New York, etc., in the 70s, I argue there were 3 kinds of white shirts. Today, there are 31 different types. Okay, you could also consider either kind of like My daughters nowadays use nail
nail
polish
polish,
or
got it.
compact and things like that. They've also evolved. Look at the changes.
Yes.
What's available also then makes a change as to what you demand. So when we look at things and people are aging, people are gaining by their experiences. Today's 80-year-old has experienced a lot more than the 80-year-old 20 years ago.
That's true.
Because in the last 20 years, things have totally changed. While the 80-year-old has changed, the 20-year also has changed. My 26-year-old daughter is very different than my 18-year-old daughter. Not because of their behavior, they're born in the same month, genes are quite similar, but within one generation, what has changed in terms of IT, consumerism, as well as, Spotify, they're both fans. I'll just give you an example. They're both fans of Taylor Swift. But Taylor Swift concerts and music used to come differently to my older daughter than to my younger daughter because many more different types of media is coming.
Right.
So that's changing the consumer. My wife is also changing because after COVID, she's never worked in an office. She works on healthcare and health policy just from my office. And I always work at home. We are very different. We need to understand changing behavior because she's changed to the changing office behavior, but I've not changed because my habits require me a lot to print and to go and see clients, so I go much more to the office.
Well, people are dynamic. They change so much the way you're explaining it to us, but institutions and systems and ecosystems don't change as fluidly.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
They take a very long time. And let me put it in context. Two of the most important prime ministers just 3 weeks ago in London, they were talking of a certain US president in a PIMCO conference, and they made the comment that for the first time, geopolitics dominates everything so much. However, the disembowelment of global institutions, which is occurring currently, will take a long time to kind of reverse. And that really is very, very concerning. WHO, WTO, UN, IMF, education. So we really need to understand that behavior changes relative to environment. Yesterday in the first slide I showed was about macroeconomics. We don't live in an isolation.
True.
If somebody came from planet Mars, Earth is defined by GDP growth, unemployment and inflation. Very concise way of looking at three things. There are probably 100 things which matter, but they all change according to the environment. If tomorrow there were meteors which were going to send down things, that would change our behavior. It's very important to note, there's a terrific book I need to recommend which tells you about how consumers are changing, because you've asked me a hard question. This guy was considered the king of consumer surveys and psychology in the world. He also was the only reason Bill Clinton, many people believe, became president. He was Bill Clinton's political advisor as well as Hillary Clinton's. The name of the book is Micro Trends, and the name of the person is Mark Penn. And he coined the term soccer moms, Amazons, older dads, etc. So these trends you need to understand, because if you don't understand these trends and you're a consumer company or you're a policymaker, you'll be left very far behind. So to understand the very fact that Gen X, Gen Y and Gen Z are also very different one to the other, forget about being different. We need to follow those trends to understand their working habits. I'll give you an example. I sit next to very young 20-year-olds. And first question many of them want to ask is, how many days can we work from home? Because that allows them the flexibility to roam at home and do whatever way. Exactly.
Work.
And I will always want to work from office. My wife works all the way from home. Even across age and across generations there are changes. And governments need to understand it, because if you don't understand it, then you don't understand. Like if I go to office, I'm having my lunch in office, my breakfast in office some days, whereas my wife is having both of them at home. So the demand for Deliveroo for her or the demand for croissant and coffee and tea for me is very different. So understanding how things change according to an environment is very interesting, but the dynamism requires you to understand psychology, economics, marketing and the environment, because we respond to all this.
So how would you, Amlan, understand retirement or rethink retirement in the age of longevity? How should we be rethinking, for instance,
I got
the
you.
retirement age. In Malaysia,
Excellent.
we're having this discourse about whether or not to raise the retirement age. What are your thoughts on
So
that?
in 2000, I challenged the whole world on it, and I'm happy to say that in the Demographic Manifesto, the first policy that I recommended, 73 governments use it to change the retirement age. It's called the Demographic Manifesto because it was radical. It says there's a demographic time bomb, growing mass of old people to be supported by a shrinking mass of young people because fertility rates and birth rates are going down.
Right.
How do we solve the problem? The first one was abolish fixed retirement age, no fixed retirement age. That's why it was radical. Have flexible enabled retirement where retirement age is linked to life expectancy but is also linked to, am I a manual worker or am I a white-collared worker? Do I have the skills to adapt or am I able, am I disabled? So there are a lot of my professors who are still working at 91, teaching at universities, one day a week or 1.5 days a week. They can because they're white-collared.
Flexible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So flexible enabled retirement was the first thing I recommended. The second solution is...
Sorry, before you get to the second, may I just very quickly jump in? When you recommended this radical idea of not having a fixed retirement age, what was the response like? What was the pushback like and what drove that pushback? Is it ideology? Is it just the way we've been doing things?
So I recommended it in 2000. In 2010, I was sitting in Hong Kong with the former Prime Minister of Malaysia and the Prime Minister of Japan. And Japan had made very teeny-weeny progress. And that Prime Minister since then, called Prime Minister Abe, he made a lot of changes and called it Abe's third arrow, which is structural reform. Structural reform means for a world of retirement, you just can't change retirement age. You also need to train people. You also need to give them better health. You also need to ensure they have better housing. And if somebody's a single grandparent living in a village, that's very different than if you're living with lots of people. So holistic change is something then in 2011 I recommended in Japan, saying you cannot just change retirement age, you need to change things around it, labor market, gender equality, consumer, as well as training. All these things should be part of lifelong learning. In 2006, the OECD published a whole series of booklets for 15 countries saying, live longer, work longer. So I challenged the French that you're lazy, you are retiring very early and working less. So now, whenever there are strikes, I'm blamed for the fact that the French retirement age was recommended to be increased on my this thing. But people cannot afford to retire at 65 because the age of 65 was appropriate in 1892 when life expectancy was 46. Most people didn't claim retirement. Today, so many more people are claiming retirement and governments are going bankrupt because 23% of European GDP is going on pensions, healthcare, long-term care, and those governments can't afford it. So my question is, who will pay for the benefits of the old people? You can't get young generations to pay 60, 70, 80%. Therefore, these solutions are very important. When older people are retiring, try to get the best out of them. In Japan, when older people are going and working 1 or 2 days per week from office, they are engaging and passing on skills to the younger generation. It's win-win. The young people are saying, oh, we did not know these crises things. Let's learn from it. Younger Japanese women are learning from older Japanese women who are looking after their children and empowering them. So society needs to change overall, and we need to be open to get. I love this conference because it's international social well-being. We need to get the best out of each individual, out of each family, each generation. Only then society will be healthy, economically productive, happy, as well as willing to give in a sense of philanthropy to the generations who are yet to come.
Fantastic.
So I want to give a quotation which we wrote in a article or a book I'll send to you called Age of Responsibility, written along with about 30 other authors, 19 institutions. At the back, there was a Greek saying. This is a company called Reddington which commissioned the report. There's a saying called, a society grows wise. This is a Greek saying of 3,000 years. A society grows wise when old people plant trees knowing that they will not benefit from the shade of the trees.
Oh, I love
So we
that.
need to create institutions that you rightly pointed out, and we need to create a society which is fit for a baby born today, as well as accepting of a 95-year-old or a 55-year-old along with their full preferences.
I think you're right. We're not thinking along the life cycle completely. So I think we're very focused and often on the working age, the productive age, and we forget the rest of the other
You
life
are
cycles.
so right, because the life cycle hypothesis developed by people who win the Nobel Prize was restricted to 3 generations. One retiree generation, one working generation, and one not working. Today, even in Malaysia, as I talked in the conference, there are 5 generations, 2 generations of retirees, one in the 90s, one in the late 60s, early 70s, only 1 generation working, and 2 again yet to enter the workforce properly. So we need to think about all these changes holistically, comprehensively, and understand the heterogeneity. So the point is that 5 old countries, they're very different in the way they behave and the way they consume and the way they retire.
So, Amlan, you talked about the radical suggestion in your
Demographic manifesto.
Are there other radical proposals in there?
Yes. So the Nordic countries changed their retirement age with life expectancy based on what we recommended. There's another thing that we recommended, that no government, no country should make unconditional promises. The only person who makes unconditional promises is a mother to her child. Promises should be flexible to the extent that the Malaysian government or the Singaporean government, I've said it to the Singaporean and Norwegian governments, you make a promise, but no one can give a promise for 20 years. Let me ask you a question which I've stopped asking after about 1,000 conferences. And the question is the following. Melisa says, Amlan, retire at 65. Joanne says, Amlan, you'll die at 85. How much money do I need for 20 years? No Nobel laureate out of 37 has answered it to me. I've asked 500 CEOs. Why? Because you can't predict inflation for 20 years, equity returns, bond returns. You don't know what my health will retire. Therefore, you need to follow it through very consequentially. And my argument is promises should be made conditional on GDP, inflation, and how well the country does. Just like, let me just complete. Yeah. So American Airlines, United Airlines, and a lot of airlines went bankrupt because they made promises long term. If you don't know how much your profitability will be or how well you will do in 20 years, how can you make a fixed promise to all your workers that you don't know relative to your profitability? So long-term promises should be within a sense of a little bit of renegotiation.
When you say long-term promises, are you referring to pensions?
Yes.
I see.
Or healthcare too.
Or healthcare.
So I'll give you an example. Earlier, company I worked for used to give me healthcare, which gave unlimited amount of call-outs. Then they said, no, 10,000 pounds. Then they said 5,000 pounds. Why is that happening? If the company's profitability is not very good, companies should have the flexibility somewhat to renegotiate the benefits. If you don't, then the company will go bankrupt, like United Airlines and American Airlines. Revenue is growing only this much, but costs going. So workers did not understand it, of the unions, etc. And I did predict that this would happen if the unions can't be convinced by the employers.
Right.
The fault was on both ends. The unions were very rigid and the employers were sitting on their high perch, not communicating well. And this is what Peter Drucker had predicted, that GM, Chrysler, Ford will have big problems because they have made pension promises they can't keep. Defined benefit pension promises are fixed. Yeah. Defined contribution are not. So defined benefit is, I would say, very liberal, very generous, and over promises. Yeah. But defined contribution under delivers. So the real best thing is a hybrid combination of the two. And this is what another Nobel laureate, Franco Modigliani, wrote in his book Rethinking Pension Reform, and he was one of the architects of DC, defined contribution in America. Okay. Yet on his deathbed he came and said, that's not a good solution because it's giving so little and people aren't educated.
Right.
So when you interview people regarding their retirement investments and go to DC, about 80 to 90% of people are lethargic, inertial, or not in the know. So they can't professionally, even people who are well trained like me in the financial services don't have time to look after their own pensions that well. And therefore, there is a need for hybrid pension plans which bring about, I would say, a good compromise of not over-promising and not under-delivering, a bit more of a realistic promise. Things need to be flexible as the economy moves out. Fixed promises for long term will not work.
I agree. Dr. Amlan Roy, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. You've really piqued my curiosity and interest into understanding demographics better. Thank you so much for bringing your knowledge to us today.
Thanks a lot. And I will end by referring to a huge bestseller book written nearly 100 and, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years ago, called A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, where he talked about genomics, living longer, etc.
Okay.
And all these same kind of problems he'd reflected as current to his time. Thank you so much,
So many book
Melissa.
recommendations you've given me. Thank you.
Because I'm not an expert, I want the world to really recognize the old experts and not forget about them.
Thank you so much for your time. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Thank you, Melissa.